Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We are sitting down with Rachel Hogan Carr of the Nurture Nature Center. Did I say that correctly?
You got that correct.
Yes. How are you today, Rachel?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Wonderful. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the Nurture Nature Center and what you do for them?
Yes, absolutely. I am the executive director at Nurture Nature Center and one of the co-founders of the center, dating back to when it was just an idea in 2007. And Nurture Nature Center today is a vibrant community center for discussing and learning about local and global environmental issues. And we use science, art, and community dialogue programming strands together to help build the capacity and knowledge of the community to understand these issues.
Interesting. Where are you folks located?
We are located at 518 Northampton Street in downtown Easton.
Oh, okay.
And we're located in a beautifully restored 100-year-old facility that was initially the home of the Independent Order of the Odd Fellows.
Oh, wow.
Yes. It's a beautiful building.
Oh, that's cool. So can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got involved in the Nurture Nature Center? I mean, you said you're a co-founder, so how did this all come to be?
It's a great story, actually. The founding of Nurture Nature Center actually comes from the issue of flooding in downtown Easton. So our parent or initial foundation, Nurture Nature Foundation, which was rooted in New York City and had addressed a wide range of environmental issues, ended up by a series of synchronicities acquiring the old Hotel Easton in downtown Easton on the 100 block. And this was a really important building to Easton's history throughout its 100-year history as well, and then went vacant for about 10 years. And Nurture Nature Foundation bought it and renovated it in the early 2000s. And I was part of the team of people who renovated that building. And it was very exciting to take this 100-year-old vacant building, take the construction down to the bare plates and rebuild it. And we put in beautiful condominiums in the building, and we put them on sale in 2006, and essentially the next day the building flooded in the third of three floods in downtown Easton in 2004, 2005, and 2006.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, it was dramatic. It was dramatic. And the point of the story is that we should have anticipated that, because this building had been underwater in much higher and worse levels in 1955 in the flood of record in the city of Easton. And there's dramatic photos that are now adorned on the walls of Nurture Nature Center if you come visit, of the hotel underwater in that flood. But it had been about 50 years since Easton had flooded, and it had become part of the city's history rather than its current thinking. And so us, like many others, went ahead and constructed without giving enough thought to the issue of flooding. And after the floods, from which we recovered, and it was not devastating, thankfully, the founder of Nurture Nature Foundation, Ted Keel, said, what could we do to help the community not get caught off guard again? I think he meant to do something small like a program, but he didn't think small if you study his history. So he tasked me and his daughter with trying to find out why Easton was flooding and what we might do about it. And that began a very long journey from 2007 until to this day. But it ultimately resulted in us creating Nurture Nature Center as a center for flood education.
Interesting. So let's stay with flooding for a second. So you said there was a flood in 1955?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm assuming the city of Easton maybe thought it was just kind of like a fluke thing because, 50-some years later, 60 years, we get hit again, but then you get hit again and again and again. Do you think those were flukes as well, or do you think there's something else going on here?
No flood is a fluke. So if you live near a river, you need to expect that it is going to rise above its banks, because really the river owns all of the real estate around it. And floodplains are formed by previous floods. So if there is a floodplain, it's because it's flooded there before. And so as soon as you begin to occupy it in any capacity, you're really encroaching on the river's territory, right? It really belongs to the river. And so periodic flooding just needs to be anticipated and expected. And of course, the downtown of Easton has a large part of its territory developed in the floodplain historically over years. And that simply is the way that it is. And that means we need to prepare and anticipate that's going to happen periodically. But yes, I think a lot of people took that 50-year hiatus and just sort of filed that event away as a historical legend. I mean, it was a truly dramatic event with the training of two storms, Connie and Diane. There's New York Times coverage of it, and it caused tremendous damage not only in Easton but throughout the whole region, worse in other places, in fact. And thankfully, we didn't see that extent again in 2004, 5, and 6. But it got close, and it was dramatic enough, and we should expect it again.
So what do you do for something like that? I mean, obviously, Easton surrounds the river. It's not like you're going to move buildings, and you're certainly not going to get enough sandbags out there to stop anything. So what do you do to anticipate a flood?
Well, and that was the question that we actually began with as a center is what do you do, right? And so the first activities of Nurture Nature Center were to try to explore and share that information. And a lot of it has to do with making sure that you're planning at a municipal level appropriately, which Easton has done well. Historically, if you look back at aerial photographs, there were many more properties in the floodplain, and they have been subsequently pulled out when damage happened over many decades. And so you try to keep your acute floodplains as clear as humanly possible. But for those buildings that are already there, sandbags end up being part of that story. But watching weather forecasts is a really critical piece of the story, and making sure that you know how to use all the tools from the National Weather Service that let you know when to expect flooding, at what levels, and know at what level your building is going to be affected so you can prepare accordingly. And these were some of the early messages that we began as Nurture Nature Center diffusing throughout the 4 states of the Delaware River Basin, trying to get people ready for the fact that floods are going to happen and you can lessen the loss by being prepared.
So let's say a flood is imminent. What can a business owner or even a person who owns a home, what kinds of things do people need to do to prepare?
Yeah. So if a flood is imminent, you're talking about it's time to probably get going and leave and evacuate safely. But prior to a flood, you want to make sure that you're properly insured. So you don't want to wait until you hear the flood is going to come, because there's a time lag in your insurance policy activation. So if you don't already have flood insurance, when you hear a flood's going to come, it's too late.
Right.
So you want to be checking your properties now. And flood insurance does not come with natural homeowners insurance. You have to add it on as a specialty. So homeowners insurance does not, by default, include flood insurance. So if you think you have any risk from flooding, even if you're outside a regulatory floodplain, you can add on a flood insurance policy. And that's a really critical first step just to ensure your financial safety. Your physical safety, again, is one of those considerations that you should think about long in advance, with looking at where your utilities are located and making sure that they're elevated out of the likely area. So if you have your gas and electric boxes in the basement, make sure they're raised up above the level of where floodwaters might actually come. Okay. Make sure you have a household evacuation plan. Make sure your important papers are stored somewhere that are not likely to flood. Think through where are the areas likely to be impacted and plan ahead.
So with regards to flooding, do you feel like the Lehigh Valley is a very common place for flooding? I mean, normally when I think of flooding, I think of like a coastal area or something like that. I tend not to think of rivers and streams that overflow. And if they do, you get some, but it's not a major impact. But you're 100% right. Those storms you talked about before, I mean, Easton saw major damage.
Absolutely.
And do you think, what are the contributing factors to those floods? Is the Lehigh Valley known for flooding, or is it just kind of like a freak thing?
Definitely not a freak thing. So the Lehigh Valley is blessed with having many beautiful waterways, and Easton has 3 waterfronts, in fact. Okay. It has the Delaware River, the Lehigh River, and the Bushkill Creek.
Oh, boy.
Yes. So it has 3 places where it interfaces with water. And floods don't matter unless you develop in them, right? So it only matters when you are living in the floodplain or you have development in the floodplain. Otherwise, the floods can come and go, and people don't pay much attention to them. So in more rural areas where rivers come and go and rise up and rise down, they may have less impact. But in the heavily developed areas, of course, it's high impact. And our waterways are historically, if you start looking at the charts with the data that National Weather Service and United States Geologic Survey and these other federal agencies have collected, flooding is a routine and regular and anticipated event along many of the waterways around here. And the data collection period is not tremendously long, but it shows consistent, repetitive flooding along all of the waterways. So, yes, it's a fact of life for Lehigh Valley communities. And riverine flooding often, as you note, doesn't get the same dramatic attention as a huge coastal flood, right?
Right.
You,
exactly.
You start talking about Superstorm Sandy, and all of the major media outlets from the entire East Coast are going to start popping and zinging because it's dramatic camera footage.
Sure.
And it's hitting really high-income properties. It's a very dramatic story. A riverine flood can come on much more slowly, like a large, wide river like the Delaware River. You get days and days of notice before a major flood is going to happen, which is great because it means you can get out of the way. But it can be somewhat a less dramatic effect until the community is underwater and then the waters recede and you see what happens afterwards. But flooding tends to be a very localized event as well. So if it didn't flood where you live, you may or may not experience tremendous impacts or even be aware of it.
So talk to me a little bit about floodplain. What is a floodplain? How wide is a floodplain? Like, how does one know that they're living in a floodplain? Like,
so as I mentioned before, a floodplain is the land adjacent to the bank of a river or stream or creek, and it's called a plain because it's generally flat, and it's the sloped land that rises up on the outside of the banks, and it's there because there was previous flooding that kind of carved the land into that shape. The regulatory floodplain is the area that is required for flood insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage. So if you have a traditional mortgage, homeowner mortgage from a traditional bank, and you are in the area that has been mapped as likely to have flooding or the regulatory floodplain, then you'll be required to have insurance. And so this is what often people are referring to when they say, do I live in the floodplain, right? But the issue of living in a floodplain is not so simple. It's not merely am I in or am I out of the floodplain. It's where am I in connection to the river. And if you're right adjacent to it, your risk is going to be much higher than if you're further afield from it, correct? And so rules and understanding about this are changing, and the Federal Emergency Management Agency is trying to redesign its flood insurance mapping program in order to account for these different realities. And there's the increasing awareness that even if you're outside what is traditionally known as the 100-year floodplain, which is a very misleading term because it surely does not mean that it's only going to flood there once in 100 years. That is the regulatory or 1% annual chance floodplain. Even if you're outside of that, you're still at risk for flooding. There's, larger areas of territory outside those areas where you can flood as well, and should expect it and plan for it. You may not be required to have insurance for it, but now you're at your own risk. And so sometimes the damage can be even worse in those cases because of that.
So talk to me a little bit about flood insurance. I mean, nobody really wants to pay for insurance. It's just one of those necessary evils.
Right.
Is flood insurance crazy expensive?
If you live in a very high-risk area, flood insurance can be quite expensive. If you live in a low-risk area or a place outside of the regulatory floodplain, your flood insurance policy can be quite affordable, and you will not naturally get it, as I mentioned before. It won't automatically come with your homeowner's policy, but it might be a really wise addition to your policy premium because it will cover water damage that comes from an intense storm. Mm-hmm. And so the policies really can range, and there's a limit to how much compensation you get back out of a claim. But for many, many, and I'd say most property owners who live in a floodplain, if you do not have flood insurance, you're really risking what is probably your primary asset. And so it's an expense that you might have to grin and bear, but you should grin and bear and do it.
Sure. I would imagine the risk versus reward is quite lopsided there.
Yes, it is. And the matter of affordability for flood insurance is a matter of national public policy, and it's heated, and it goes before Congress, and there's been many proposals and efforts to try to reform it to make it more affordable. And there's equity issues in there associated, and it's very complicated. But it's a worthwhile thing to pursue for most homeowners who have any risk of flooding.
Yeah, so I would imagine, you talk about the folks with the coastal flooding and the folks that can afford that type of insurance versus some inner city folks that may not necessarily have the means to pay for that. So I'm hoping that they can figure out a way to bring that cost down and make it affordable for everybody.
Exactly. So some flood-prone homes are coastal homes, as you say, are second or third vacation homes for people.
Correct.
And in other cases, it's people's primary asset that they have in life. And so losing everything means quite literally losing everything. So there is definitely big disparity in how flooding can affect a property owner.
So staying with flooding, this is a question that I've always wanted to know.
Hopefully I can answer.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. What is flash flooding? Every time you hear,
Yes.
a major storm comes in, oh, look out, we're going to get flash flooding. What on earth is that?
Yes. So flash flooding is the sudden quick rise, usually of a smaller stream or creek. So the large, slow Delaware River Basin, as I mentioned, has these slow, steady rises, generally from very heavy precipitation events. That's the primary reason that the river is going to flood, because we get a huge storm that dumps 6 or 8 or 10 inches of rain, and it outpaces the basin's ability to swallow the water fast enough. On the smaller creeks or streams, like the Bushkill Creek, say in Easton, to keep with an Easton story, although this is true along all of the smaller streams and creeks, there's a lot less room to absorb heavy rain. So if you have a smaller body of water that gets 6, 8, or 10 inches or even less of rain, it has nowhere to go, and it will rise really, really rapidly. And so a flash flood can happen immediately before your eyes. You can be looking at a body of water that you can see is moving quickly, and you can watch it rise before your eyes. And this presents the most dangerous circumstances.
So kind of like if you have a slow tub drain or something like that,
Yeah.
and as you're dumping water in there, and then all of a sudden it just kind of picks up real quick.
Exactly. And that's a flash flood. And that is what is often most dangerous to life, because if you find, and I've heard terrible stories of campers who are in mountain ravines, and all of a sudden huge amounts of water come rushing through the mountain creeks or streams at a really fast rate, or you're trying to cross a road crossing and it looks like a little bit of water, and all of a sudden the water rises very quickly in front of you and your car is being swept away. These are the risks associated with flash flooding. And they happen very quickly. They're very dramatic. They're very high impact. They're very dangerous. They happen so quickly and they fall so quickly, they don't often get the news coverage, as you said,
Sure.
of these larger coastal events. And so in many cases, they can be as risky or more, and not get quite the same flash for media coverage.
For lack of a better word.
Flash.
So can flash flooding cause as much damage as like the normal floods that get the...
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Somebody once said, and I thought that this was a great phrase, that the most expensive inch of a flood is the last inch, the one that gets into your house, right?
Sure.
Right, exactly. So, so if you look at the Delaware River, the flood stage is 22 feet. So when it gets to 22 feet, that's when it's starting to really kick into flood stage. Our major floods went up to 37 or 38 feet.
Wow.
Connie and Diane flood went up even higher than that. But it's really that end of the flood that matters the most. So even with a flash flood, it doesn't matter. It's still water. And if it rises quickly and it reaches into your property and gets to your drywall or your utilities, they can wreak a lot of havoc.
Because it's not just the wetness. Like
Right.
it ruins the drywall. You can get black mold
Absolutely.
in there. So they have to cut everything out. Like
Yep.
I've known several people that have had some flood damage, and it is a nightmare. My uncle is still working on his. He had some flash flooding issues, and his whole basement got covered. And I mean, that probably happened 6 months ago, and he's still dealing with the problem today.
Absolutely. The problems are long, and then the paperwork and the bureaucracy associated with getting your insurance claims is complicated. Flash floods can be a little bit more problematic because they're more frequent, because it requires less rain and less precipitation to cause the rise. So smaller streams and creeks can flood more frequently than the larger river basins, which can absorb much more water without having a flood reaction.
I see.
That was actually the founding question that our founder asked us.
Oh, no kidding.
He wondered, why was the Delaware River Basin flooding what seemed like so frequently in such a short period of time? And could we attribute this to development in the basin and to suburban development in outlying areas? Was that causing an impact? And that was our initial question to go uncover. And it's more complicated than that. That kind of development on landscapes will cause flooding on these streams and creeks by causing more runoff. Rivers generally can absorb more. So while there is an effect from development, the bigger effect really comes from tremendous precipitation events.
See, it's interesting that you say that. I remember I grew up in East Allen Township when I was a kid, and back then it was all farmland. Well, now there's so much more development there, and there was a huge flood that happened a couple years ago, and I remember a couple friends that still live there who got majorly impacted. Where we kind of lived was kind of in a basin, and it was all surrounded by farmland. Now that there are a lot more sidewalks, a lot more streets, when all this rainwater dumped, it just kind of all converged into this one area. And unfortunately, my buddy's house was at the pinnacle of it, and they were basically underwater, just because there was nowhere for the water to go.
Exactly. So impervious surfaces and increasing the amount of pavement and paved territory just increases the rate that the water can travel from into the streams, and it can just exacerbate those problems. And so communities are starting to try to plan more creatively to think about how they can buffer their watersheds and create riparian buffer zones along the sides of streams and creeks and rivers in order to create more room to capture more of that water. And of course, state stormwater management laws are getting much more stringent and requiring builders to account for the water that they are displacing through their development. But it creates a cumulative effect that's real.
Are there different techniques that are being cultivated? Obviously, nobody wants a ton of storm drains around their entire neighborhood. Where everywhere you go, it's great. So are there other techniques that are being developed to try to help mitigate this as we continue to develop? I mean, we're only getting bigger as a society. Yes,
the field of green infrastructure and green stormwater management is a really hot area where people are trying to figure out better ways than the traditional piping methods, which just take water from one area and pipe them as quickly as possible away to another area. And there's a lot of work being done about how do we infiltrate the water back into the land, how do we create systems that allow the natural water cycle to function more efficiently. A lot of municipalities and places and homeowners are doing things like rain gardens and other sorts of projects where they can, accommodate the water on their properties better.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talked a lot about flooding so far. Do you think global warming has anything to do with increased flooding?
Well, the science is pretty clear that extreme weather is one of the expected outcomes from climate change. And a really simple way to articulate the way that it will affect flooding, at least for the Lehigh Valley and the Northeast region, is that wetter areas should expect to get wetter and drier areas should expect to get drier.
Okay.
So we unfortunately fall into the wetter areas category, because having water is a beautiful thing. So I'm not going to say it's unfortunate, but for the sake of flooding, wetter areas will get wetter. So we should expect an increase in the frequency of really high precipitation events, which could increase the likelihood of flooding. It's something that our community should be planning for and thinking about actively at this point.
Are we?
Many are,
okay.
Actually.
That's good.
Nurture Nature Center has recently helped the city of Easton to develop a climate action plan that it considers things like this. The city of Bethlehem also does, and Allentown as well. So communities are starting to take a look at how they can plan in partnership with local businesses and their residents to think about these kinds of impacts.
So does the Nurture Nature Center, do they only solely focus on flooding, or are there other environmental factors that you guys focus on as well?
Oh, goodness. Oh, yeah. We absolutely look at the whole range of environmental issues. So our founding was this question about why is it flooding and what can we do to help other communities and help our community be better prepared for it. And we set out with that mission in mind and did a lot of programming about flooding in our early years. And then when we opened our facility to the public in 2011, with the installation of the Science on a Sphere exhibit, which is a big 6-foot globe that shows Earth and space science programs of hundreds of different beautiful visualizations of Earth and space science. I mean, really, really mind-blowing sorts of things. The community started coming for our programs and started asking about other topics. So in addition to this, what do we know about the other range of environmental issues? And so since our opening in 2011, Nurture Nature Center now addresses a large range of global and local environmental issues. We've done a lot of programming about local issues with our community, about things like how do we manage our landscape through pesticides and things like that. But we also deal with global phenomenon as well.
Okay. Let's jump back a minute. We had touched a little bit about extreme weather. Is there like a definition that describes what extreme weather is?
Extreme weather would be defined by me as the high impact weather that happens outside the frequency of normal events. So every year we're going to have snowy days here in the Lehigh Valley, and we come to expect that. Extreme weather is when the quantity of snow becomes so much that it's starting to shut down our roads, jeopardize the structures that are of our rooftop capacity to handle it, create quite frequently major traffic congestion and accidents. So if we think about, winter storms can have extreme weather, thunderstorm, extreme weather, convective activity can cause tremendous damage, high winds, power outages. Of course, flooding would fall in that category. Tornadoes, tornadic activity, which thankfully we don't have too much of here in the Lehigh Valley, although they happen.
And it's starting to increase. Am I correct in saying that?
There have been a few small events that have been reported in recent years, and I don't know enough about the tornado history to say whether or not it is increasing, but I think everybody has started to notice the reporting about a few of these cyclonic events and derechos and starting to wonder whether or not those look like they're increasing. But it's enough to say that they certainly happen and that there's something we should be aware of. But thankfully, we're not one of the hot spots for tornado activity like other places in the world are.
Like Tornado Alley.
Like Tornado Alley,
which
exactly.
I just don't quite understand. If you know that you're going to get these major nasty storms that have the potential to mess up your home, maybe you want to live somewhere else.
Yeah, unfortunately for many people, the choices are limited, and everywhere in the world faces its risks, right?
Yeah.
And so the question becomes, how do we live safely with the weather and with the earth where we are? How do we come to agreements with our landscape about how we're going to live safely here? And that's a lot of the kinds of topics we talk about at Nurture Nature Center. What are we going to, arrangements and agreements are we going to make about how we manage our lands, how we manage our properties, how we prepare, knowing that we're humans here coexisting on a planet that has extreme weather, that has risks, and that we can contribute to or detract from in various ways.
Do you think there is an uptick in extreme weather globally?
Well, certainly the climate science suggests that is the case and to be expected, that we are having. Nobody feels very comfortable attributing specific events generally to climate change, right? So if we have a huge superstorm coming through or a huge event, it's very difficult because extreme weather is a natural part of the Earth, processes as well. So it's difficult to kind of point to any given event and say that's what it is. But the record that has been explored by the many scientists over the years, and most recently there's a new report out from the IPCC that suggests that extreme weather is definitely here to stay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, maybe it's just because it's being reported more, but I just feel like over the last couple of years we've seen some really gnarly storms come through not only our area, but through the United States in general. And I know we kind of touched a little bit about this with flooding, but are there certain things that folks can do? Like, is there like a extreme weather preparedness kit that they can kind of put together in their house so that, God forbid, we either get whacked with a big snowstorm or hurricanes come through here? Now, I know it's not as bad as if you were living right on the coast, but we've certainly seen damage come through here from hurricanes.
Certainly.
Are there things that folks can do to better prepare themselves for this type of extreme weather?
Yes. In fact, Nurture Nature Center has a program right now, a project that we've been running, funded through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of Education. So NOAA is the parent body of the National Weather Service.
Isn't that interesting in itself?
Yeah.
NOAA, you think of Noah's Ark and all that stuff. Wow, that's hilarious. Did they mean to do that?
No,
wow.
It's just the natural acronym.
Not to get biblical, but that just made me...
Yeah,
wow, that's funny.
Well, we actually created a character named Noah who is the little boy champion in our flood coloring workbook. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But NOAA's Office of Education actually is the agency that installed our Science on a Sphere, and that does a lot of education about this extreme weather sort of information. And they're funding a project for us called Create Resilience, which is working in the Easton, Bangor, and Wilson area school districts in order to build community knowledge about and resiliency to extreme weather and climate-related hazards. And as part of that project, during the period of time when we couldn't interact with people well because of COVID, we created an outreach of emergency preparedness kits. And we went to public places and we prepared for people little red buckets filled with the things exactly as you suggest that you might need. And we were really overwhelmed at how well received that was and how much interest people really do have in preparing their properties but aren't quite familiar with what to do. And the items that we put in our little red buckets, which were rather cute and charming, were things like glow sticks, a USB flash drive to remind people to save all your important documents somewhere other than on the laptop, back up your documents, emergency food. We have a multi-purpose tool that, like a little sharp little tool that can, help you, flashlights, those sorts of objects, Mylar, blankets in case you should be stranded. There are great checklists that are available for emergency preparedness kits and evacuation bags, sometimes called Go Bags or Go Kits.
Yep.
There's a great website for this called ready.gov. Nurture Nature Center has prepared one of these as well. And really, homes should have a place where all of this information is and is ready to go in a backpack, in a bucket in somewhere, and also one in your car, because
Yes.
as we see what happened last year or earlier this year with interstates shutting down, with snowstorms, and all of a sudden highways are shut down. People were sleeping on their car in Virginia on I-95 overnight, all right? And so you should make sure also that you have these supplies in your car as well as in your home.
Blanket,
All of that good stuff, because you feel like it's not going to happen. And then when it does, if you're not ready, it's too late to be ready for it.
If you fail to prepare,
You're preparing to fail?
Yeah.
If you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. That's right.
So with regards to extreme weather, I also noticed you guys do some research with flooding and risk communication. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. So I mentioned that one of the first things we did was outreach and education about how to prepare for floods and use forecast products throughout the 4 states of the Delaware River Basin. And we learned during those early days that people struggle to understand weather forecasts sometimes. It's a lot of technical data. There's maps and charts and graphs that come out that tell you what to expect, but if you don't properly interpret those, you can't take the right actions to prepare. And so we began a series of multiple studies that we have now been funded by NOAA and the National Weather Service, social science research studies, to help them improve their forecast products, specifically flooding and winter storm. And so if there's going to be a flood on local rivers across the country, they have a whole suite of products and maps and graphics that they'll put out to let people know exactly how high the river's going to reach at what time. And they have many different ways of showing the range of probabilities for these. There's a 80% chance your river will get this high. There's a 50% chance it'll get this high. And as their technical capability to forecast has improved, the challenges of communicating that well have gotten harder. And so our research team has been working over the past 10 years to take these products and present them in focus group formats to professional and residential users, the people who should be using them in their course of work as emergency managers or water resource managers, or property owners who live in a floodplain, as we've been discussing, and showcase these products to them and get a sense of how they're understanding them or not. And then we revise them based on what we learn. We mock up the products again. We retest them with new users. And we keep going through this process until we can make recommendations back that say, here's how this information really needs to be presented in order to be most useful. And that line of programming has been really rewarding because the National Weather Service is very grateful for this feedback and then incorporates our recommendations into its products. So nationally, across the country, the kinds of products that they're issuing now have gathered feedback from our research about how the best ways to show that data. And we get good feedback that people are making better use of these products now that they've been redesigned.
So essentially, you're dumbing it down for the layperson, correct?
We're making it easier to understand.
Okay, and that's a much better way to phrase it.
But we're trying to make it easier to understand and easier to motivate people to take action because they can quickly identify what the risk is. When you have a tremendous amount of data packed densely onto a map with lots of places and very detailed legends, it can be hard to quickly look and say, am I at risk? Do I need to do anything here or not? And as we know, people don't have very long attention spans. And if they don't fairly quickly identify that they're at risk, they might move on to the next phase, right?
Right. So tell me I'm either going to get flooded or not.
Or not, right? And I want to know. And then professional users need to make much more nuanced decisions than that, right? And then so these products need to work for the person who's going to spend 5 seconds with them and then the person who's going to spend a lot of time with them. So it's a very complicated job of trying to make recommendations that are going to make the best use for the most number of users. And the National Weather Service is an amazing partner because the meteorologists and hydrologists across this country care deeply about what they do. And they work so hard to get the forecast right. They really want the information to go out in a way that is going to help people. So they're really, good partners in this regard.
So how do you do that? How do you give graphical information that works for the pros and for John Q. Public?
It can be difficult. Our art director is skilled in visual risk communication, and so we use that set of skills and gather the feedback from the users about the most critical pieces of information that we have and try to tier the information so that the most frequently needed information is most easily accessed. And then those who are professional users and who will spend more time in it can be instructed in the ways to dig deeper and deeper and find more as they need. But we also try to help make recommendations to forecasters, who are the ones who will often take these various products that exist and put them out into what they call briefing packages, right? Sure. So they'll assemble a whole bunch of these and put it out as a PDF, and this might get circulated on social media. And we kind of talk with them about how people are understanding this and how to frame the information so that people realize, yeah, flood's coming. I better get that Go kit I was talking about and get moving because this matters to me.
Right.
One of the great stories we heard in this research was right after Superstorm Sandy, we went to Ocean and Monmouth counties, which were really heavily affected. We talked with residents there, and we looked at what had been issued to them and said, what worked and what didn't work for you to motivate you to take action? And one woman said, they kept talking about this storm, and I knew it was affecting all the towns around me, but it wasn't until a newscaster said the name of my little town that I realized, oh, this is for me too. And if you know the Jersey Beach, you know that every 2 miles it's a new town name, but it's all connected. But to her, the fact that all the surrounding towns were being affected, she didn't quite hit home until it was hers. And that's how we make these decisions, right? We make these decisions when we've identified this is a personal matter. So that's the job. How do you get people to interpret these and take action? And it's really rewarding research. We get to meet really interesting people in locations across the country, Colorado, California, New York, who've all been affected by floods and extreme weather. They care a lot. They're neat people, and it's been fun work.
I think anytime you take something that is so big and so broad and you're able to funnel it down to, the everyman's, and get them to understand it, that's huge work. I mean, not only are you doing stuff on a massive global scale, but you're getting people to understand it, which I think is even more important.
Yeah, I actually think that this process that we go through is an educational program that all school children should go through. Learning how to read weather forecast products should be just a skill for being a basic citizen of your community, so you know how to stay safe and be ready. And it never dawned on me until we did this. You have to be taught. It's just,
Yeah. But that's a really good idea.
Yeah, that'll be our next project.
There you go. Weather forecasting. That was weather forecasting today. Oh, it was great, Dad. Thanks. So we talked a lot about flooding and extreme weather. Are there any other environmental issues that we, specifically here in the region, that we have to be watchful for?
Nurture Nature Center has done a lot of programming over the years on a range of environmental topics that have been brought to our attention by community partners and residents and municipalities, and of course by our own staff, as being really kind of critical considerations for the public health and well-being. And some of them have been fun, and some of them have been really serious. But we really take a kind of a bottoms-up approach of letting the community help us identify what is critical. And we did a community needs assessment a number of years back to identify what exactly are the topics that people really care about, right? And we learned through that process of a special one, which is the transport of crude oil by rail. And this was brought to our attention by the local fire department, that our area is the pass-through area for crude oil that comes from Canada and gets shipped through to other areas. And so you'll see on the railways sometimes these large, long tankers going through, and they just are black round tankers, and you'll see one after the other, after the other, after the other, and perhaps pay no mind to what's in there. But in fact, it's crude oil.
Oh my gosh, I tell my son it's orange juice.
It's orange juice, yes. It's not exactly orange juice. And that's fine so long as those tanks stay on the rails.
Sure.
But a number of years ago, there was one that ended up hanging off a cliff, hanging on the edge in Philadelphia, and it really brought attention to the fact, thankfully, it didn't go into the water, but had it, that could have been quite an environmental catastrophe to get all of that oil into the rivers. And so we held a program about that brought people up from Philadelphia and experts from the railway industry to come in and describe the technology that's being advanced to do this more safely. We brought in a NOAA specialist who would be the one to do the environmental cleanup after these things happen, and he reported about what it's like to go into the waterways. And so there's, periodically these various topics that become really important for us to consider. Another is pesticide use and the appropriate use of how do you manage the invasive species that get brought into our region from other locations. And the Lehigh Valley faces a large quantity of one in particular called Japanese knotweed. It is by no means the only one, but it's one that's very frequent. And once you identify it and you then drive along the waterways, you say, oh, knotweed, 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 knotweed. And it can quickly really take over the landscape along the riverbanks. But treating it is very difficult. You have to pull it out over and over and over. You have to cut it down. You have to cut it down, or you put chemicals, which will be more effective in putting back the knotweed, but then they run into the waterways, and then you've damaged the water health. And so we've done programs about these kinds of topics as well, trying to help our community residents as well as community leaders think through their options for doing this.
Plus, that's probably a lot of manpower to pull something like that off, right?
Oh, of course, and these can grow really rapidly.
Sure.
Yes. In fact, we held a program where we brought in a man who was renting his herd of goats from upstate New York.
I did hear about this. Yeah.
And he came into Nurture Nature Center, and he talked about how the goats love to eat this stuff. It's healthy for them. They'll eat anything in their path. And ultimately, the city of Easton did bring him in for a while, and goats were eating the Japanese knotweed at Hugh Park, which was a really neat opportunity for the public to see this approach. And the city is not using pesticides. They've made that decision. And so these are important community decisions that I think need to be brought together, and that's what we like to do.
How effective were the goats, do you think?
The goats do a really great job of it, actually. I know whether it's sustainable over huge, large territories, getting the goats on a craggy riverbank might be difficult, but in certain locations, it's certainly an option. And it's a moment to highlight that we need to think about the ways that we deal with these things, right? And not just dump the first bottle of chemicals that we can.
Well, it's certainly innovative.
It's certainly innovative, yeah.
That's cool.
The invasive species can be problematic because they crowd out the area available for the native species that would occupy an area. And when you start decreasing the available space for native species, then the local native pollinators that would eat on these are finding their food supplies running out. And so this is why there's a lot of emphasis happening on creating, pollinator gardens. If you hear about this in the news or in various gardening programs, which we run as well, what kind of species should you be planting in your backyard properties and gardens in order to support the supply of native species that we have here, and keep food sources abundant for them. Actually, we have recently partnered with Penn State Master Watershed Steward Program to create the Watershed-Friendly Certification Program. And so a property owner who is intending and trying to do the right thing by taking care of the watershed health and taking care of things like pollinators and their stormwater management can go onto our website and fill out an application. And if they pass at a sufficient level about how they manage their property, they get certified as a watershed-friendly certification and get a nice, really beautiful sign for their yard, indicating that this is a property that's being managed for pollinators, for the watershed health, and environmentally beneficial ways.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's a very, very cool program.
So let's switch gears here. I see in my notes here something about chickens. Do we have an issue with chickens?
If you want chickens, it depends on where you live, whether you have a problem or not. Chickens became an issue for Nurture Nature Center a number of years back because some property owners wanted to be able to have backyard chickens in order to provide eggs for their family.
Be a little bit more sustainable.
And be a little bit more sustainable. And it became a question of whether this was in fact safe. And it was around the time that there was a swine flu going on, and people weren't understanding and sure about this. And so Nurture Nature Center held a forum about that topic as well. And we brought in experts who really looked at it from the health perspective as well as the municipal planning perspective, and kind of looked at other places that had or had not allowed it and why and what were the terms. And it was a really exciting program. About 85 people showed up, only a couple of whom actually would have maybe put chickens in their yard.
I was going to ask you, I was like, if this is an issue, there had to have at least been a decent amount of people that had chickens in their backyard.
Well, ultimately, the city of Easton didn't allow it, and so nobody has chickens in their backyard in the city of Easton. But outlying more rural townships have more land and more capacity to do it, and so some places do. But this is one of those kind of, issues that's becoming more of an urban consideration as they try to figure out ways to be more sustainable. And so ultimately in the city, it was resolved that they weren't going to allow it. But it's the way that Nurture Nature Center tries to operate to, be responsive to the issues that are coming up, as well as being proactive and looking down the road at things that might happen. But we really serve as a place where the community can come together, learn together side by side. At that presentation, we had community leaders and public health people there alongside the residents, all learning together from the experts, and then let everybody go home and make the decisions that they want to make. And it's a pretty neat model.
So how did it end up? So Easton is still not allowing?
No, yeah. Their city council ultimately voted against allowing it. And this has a lot to do with lot size and the average amount of available land for properties. And Easton is a pretty dense community. I know in neighboring townships and areas that they do allow it. So it really depends on where you live.
And I guess that would be a slippery slope too, because if you allow the chickens, then you've got, let's see, the next evolution would be pigs, and then you got cows, and before you know it, you got a full-blown farm in your neighbor's backyard, and you're like, I'm not sure I'm feeling this. So
I doubt there's a danger of too many farms in
I guess you're right.
In the city of Easton, but other communities have decided differently for various reasons and for different capacities and that sort of thing. So it is definitely a trending topic.
Backyard farms.
What is the actual environmental danger? Is it just the waste from chickens? That's the problem?
The primary concern is the waste and
the smell. That would drive me nuts.
And pretty much everyone agrees no roosters because the noise would be.
Goodness.
Yeah, so nobody seems to ever advocate that there should be roosters in an urban dense area. But yeah, it's human health concerns and cleanliness that people most worry about.
Total sidebar. I was hiking in Peru, and Peru does not have rules about backyard chickens and roosters and what have you. And I had never actually been around a rooster. 4:00 in the morning, this guy was getting up and letting us all know it's time to break down and get your butt on the trail. So yeah, I'm all for.
You're all for that.
No roosters in backyards. That would be.
No, we don't need that.
That's my vote.
Noisy enough.
So let's talk a little bit more about pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
And are we talking commercial pesticides? Are we talking, your neighbor uses Roundup? Like what is the issue with pesticides?
All of that. So from soup to nuts, pesticides are designed to kill, and they are designed to target specific, plants and kill them. But they're not terribly discriminating, and whatever you pour on the ground is going to end up in the waterways. And so the accumulation of pesticides into our waterways is not good for water quality health, and that happens in several ways, as you point out. So there's definitely, of course, the pretty tightly highly regulated agricultural application. But then the homeowner level is much less well regulated. So your homeowner who is applying these is not trained in how much it is required and how to apply it appropriately. And so cumulatively, that can start to add up pretty quickly. And so at the next level up in between those, then, of course, is kind of the larger scale commercial properties or larger scale use by municipalities dealing with entire, say, parkways or, that sort of area. I mentioned earlier that the city of Easton has taken the step to no longer use them on their properties, and they use alternative methods for dealing with their unwanted plant growth there. And we really, really applaud that, because I think it's showing leadership in preserving and caring about the quality of the waterways that we have here.
So even if your property isn't even remotely close to a waterway, using Roundup would still not be ideal, correct?
Absolutely. We all live in a watershed, and every drop of water that falls in a watershed ultimately keeps going and winding its way until it ends up in the river or stream. It looks like it disappears perhaps into the storm drain, or it looks like it evaporates, but it's all part of a cycle. And so it all ends up in the waterway that is the primary waterway of your watershed, wherever that is.
Interesting.
And so just like you don't want to pour oil when you're changing your oil in your car in the street, you don't want to pour that down the drain. Everything that we pour down the drain is going to end up in our waterways. So we really need to be thoughtful about our chemical application and use those only when would be absolutely needed.
Are there tips and tricks that you can offer to our listeners to use other than pesticide? I've got a buddy of mine who might as well work for Roundup. He uses it so much. So obviously I would love to get him on the straight and narrow.
I would suggest people research the alternatives and talk to skilled plant folks about that, right? And so we have a gardening program at Nurture Nature Center. We have an area called the Urban Recycle Garden in the back of our building. And we do a series of workshops showing ways that you can grow food and manage stormwater in small urban areas. And we're one of many sorts of organizations and places that will teach you different and alternative methods for managing your property. And there are definitely strategies that you can use. I'm not the plant expert to vouch for any given one of them, but it's a programming topic we've addressed a few times, and there are resources out there for it. You might be doing more manual labor if you're choosing to do this. It might be an investment in more manual labor to be pulling the weeds, or letting your lawn go naturalized a bit. Be okay with clover coming up in your green lawn. Be okay with some of different kinds of grasses popping up and seeing the diversity. These feed local native species. They don't look exactly like the traditional curated green lawn that has come to symbolize sort of the American ideal. But a lot of that is changing, and people are starting to understand that the more naturalized lawns that grow a little bit longer, sections of lawn are replaced by grassy substitutes, and other areas and walkways can be really beautiful as well.
See, I'm so happy that you said that, because my mom for years has been giving me a hard time about pulling weeds in my yard, because I don't particularly, it's not that I'm lazy, I just don't want to be spraying all those chemicals in my yard.
Right.
So I pull what I can, but then there's a lot of stuff in there that's kind of more natural. So I do have the clover in my front yard, and
Dandelions.
it's not the typical, what's the green thumb that comes through and sprays everything. I mean, but my yard doesn't look bad. I mean, it's not overgrown with, weeds and everything else. Like I said, I pull it around the flower beds, but I don't have your typical green front yard.
That's great, because you're really supporting the local environment. You're supporting local native species that need more diversity to eat. They can't all just eat that green grass. It's not going to. So you have a good excuse now.
Thank you very much for the validation. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. But it really is an important topic to look around and say how each little piece of property that we have is contributing to our well-being and to our health. And it also is fun. It's recreation. When you start getting creative and thinking about how can I plant different species in my yard and how can I do this, it's really a great pastime as well.
Yeah, she's always like, take pride in your yard. I was like, I do.
I do.
It's clean. It just looks different from yours. That's all. And now I'm helping the environment. That's that, Ma.
Don't rake your leaves up either in the fall.
Really?
Yeah. You don't have to do that either. And that'll create, great moist areas, and you don't have to do that either.
Oh, my neighbors will not like to hear that. So I've got very particular neighbors, and they're out there, and they work very diligently on their lawn, and it's immaculate. I will not take anything away from them, but they're also the type of folks that, a leaf gets in their yard, and that came from your tree. And I'm like, well, yeah, first of all, I got 2 small kids. I didn't have time to go out there and rake them yet today, but I'll get out there. So leaving the leaves on the ground does what?
At the end of the season, if you want to leave your leaves on the ground when the trees fall and let it there, it creates a nice, rich ground cover that is a habitat for the little critters and species that stay there. And then you can just rake them up in the spring, and you have, your land has been protected over the years, and there's no harm done. We do it on our property at home, and we've gotten our neighbors all kind of used to it, and everybody's in the spirit. So
that's awesome. I'm going to use that excuse now. Yeah, I'm creating a habitat.
You're creating habitat.
That's
exactly.
Right. That's
yes,
right. I'll get them in the spring.
Yes.
Don't worry. So you had mentioned in the beginning something about art and art programs. How does art and environmental, how does that all mesh together?
Sure. Yeah, I had mentioned in the beginning that we use science, art, and community dialogue. Those are the 3 strands of programming that you'll constantly hear us talking about, because we try to integrate those together. And we've talked here about some of the science topics that we address, from flooding and climate change and pesticides. And I've indicated that there's a lot of community engagement in terms of how we structure those programs so that residents are learning with us and kind of feeding up. But these are complicated issues to discuss, and they have some value issues involved in them and some cultural considerations, as we've been discussing. People have different values and different things that they care about and different ways that they want to handle things. And our art programming, it becomes a really critical way for people to come together and reflect on these issues in a safe and civil sphere, right? And so we have 4 art galleries in our building where we have rotating exhibits of regional and local and sometimes national artists addressing many of these environmental issues that we talk about in our science and community programming at the center. And so we have a series of exhibits throughout the year that if you come in quarterly, we have one opening actually on April 8th called Climate Conversations All You Can Save, which is a group of 8 female artists from the Northeast and Michigan areas who are creating pieces of art that will go throughout our entire building, including our first floor ballroom, in response to a book called All We Can Save, which are essays about climate change. And so that'll be a show that we program very heavily with lots of different audiences, with youth and adult audiences, to come in and reflect on these pieces of art and think about, what does it mean, all we can save? What is our relationship to our climate and to the activities that we're taking here? And our arts programming has become really critical to the identity of Nurture Nature Center, because it brings in people who might not traditionally identify as a science learner immediately, but we all care about our environment. We all care about where we live, right? And so art creates, a space where people can come together and discuss these issues in a safe and open way.
Is this open to the public? Is it a paid type thing?
Sure. So our center includes the Science on a Sphere exhibit, 4 art gallery spaces, and other science exhibits as well. It's open on Wednesdays and Saturdays from 12 to 4, and admission is always free. The only time we charge for entry to our center is if you're coming for a specific workshop that might have heavy materials. So maybe we're going to be doing an arts workshop where you'll come in and create something that you take home with you. We do a summer series for kids called Create and Learn, where the adults and kids work together to learn some science and then do a hands-on arts activity that reinforces the learning. And those are paid, but primarily visits to Nurture Nature Center are always free, so that everyone is welcome to come in, tour the art exhibits, take part in our community programming, see a show on the Science on a Sphere exhibit, and enjoy their time there.
So besides the exhibits, is Nurture Nature Center open to the public during normal business hours, or?
Right now, we were closed during the COVID period for a good year and a half almost. And right now our open to the public hours are Wednesdays and Saturdays, 12 to 4.
Okay.
And then by special event. So we do both special event programming at our center and elsewhere. We'll be starting up our star parties again this summer, where we bring telescopes down to Scott Park by the convergence of the Delaware and Lehigh River.
Oh, cool.
And invite invite people to come down with us and, set up telescopes and learn how to look through them. And we tell them what they're looking at. And we have our senior science educator who's down there, and he's able to show people what they're looking at. So we do special events outside those open house hours as well. Things like art receptions on Friday, April 8th will be outside those hours.
So go back
free.
Go back to the star parties. How often do those happen? And
star parties we've been hosting about monthly during the warm months, when viewing is good. And of course, they're subject to weather. So if it ends up being a particularly rainy day or a super cloudy night, then we have to change the date on those. So you want to stay current, following our website or our social media accounts to find out when those are held. But they're really popular. We hold those on weekend nights when downtown Easton is hopping. And so people are out and they're getting dinner and they're walking around town. They can walk over, spend a little bit of time with us at the telescopes and enjoy their night and learn a little something, and then keep on enjoying their evening.
Is it BYOT, or do you guys have your own telescopes?
We have our own telescopes. Yep.
Okay,
you don't
cool.
have to bring your own, although we do have people who have come to us and said, I have a telescope and I don't know how to use it. And so we've done a couple of workshops to teach people how to use their telescopes. Space programming generally is really popular at Nurture Nature Center. When the solar eclipse happened a number of years ago, we had a solar eclipse party, which had over 600 people coming through our center in one day. We have a connection to NASA through some work that we've done, and we were able to get some live streaming of NASA's observations on what was happening, and we got glasses so people could safely view the eclipse. And we had lines quite literally around the block for that.
No kidding.
Yeah. So space is a hot topic. Yeah. And we're doing some cool programming right now on the James Webb Telescope. We did some Science on a Sphere shows about the new James Webb Telescope that's out there in space that is going to show much larger areas than has ever been seen by any of the other telescopes. I mean, it just dwarfs what Hubble telescope was able to show us. And we actually have an art installation about that that's going into the center as well. So this is another really hot topic. People love to come kind of reflect on where are we on Earth and what can we learn about it by looking at what's out there.
Have you ever partnered with like any of the local planetariums or anything like that in the area?
No, we haven't, although the astronomy buffs have found us.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we have made a lot of friends with the folks around here who love astronomy.
Cool. Very cool. All right. So let's say people are interested in Nurture Nature Center. Mm-hmm. Where can they find you? How can they get in contact with you? I mean, you told me the physical address, but I mean, is there like a website or anything?
Yeah, so people who want to learn more about our programs can visit our website, which is nurturenaturecenter.org. We also use Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and our Nurture Nature Center is our name for those. And we have an email sign-up list that people can get on where we put an email out every 2 weeks that lets you know about our upcoming programs. And generally, our calendar of events is a rotating series of programs on our Science on a Sphere, which will change topics from geology to climate to food to, it's a wide operating array. And then we'll have evolving art shows and community lectures, film series. So it's a rotating schedule that you might see if you start to follow our programs.
And if folks wanted to get involved, they heard about the flooding issues that we're having here or anything like that, how do folks get involved with Nurture Nature Center? So same deal, Facebook?
Yeah, same deal, but one of the best things to do is come on in, spend some time, come and meet our docents who are there on the Science on a Sphere when we're open. And we have a very friendly environment where you can come in and say, look at the Science on a Sphere and say, I really want to know a little bit more about this topic. And our docent will be like, I have just the thing that you want to see there. And you're able to, kind of call up and build a relationship. Our website has the contact information for all of our team if you want to reach out to anyone in particular. But if you have an interest in gardening, we have our gardening coordinator, we have a science director, we have our art director, we have an outreach educator. So you can kind of channel your interests, but we definitely love making new friends. So please come visit us and get to know us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We're looking for volunteers to help in the garden on a regular basis and with other programs, so we would love to hear from people.
Excellent. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Rachel Hogan Carr, Nurture Nature Center. Thank you so much.
Thank you.